So welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today's another Q&A with some very generous people. The podcast to be discussed today is the first of 4 podcasts in this Selfless series, and it's subtitled Do Yourself a Kindness. Our participants have watched the podcast of that name, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life. But I'll do a quick summary of part 1 now before we go into our Q&A. So the first podcast of this Selfless series examines the ways in which being compassionate is really good for us. It begins with might seem a paradoxical injunction, and that is, if you feel you're burning out, practice compassion. When you're low, feeling tired and burdened by negative emotion, you might do yourself the kindness of being compassionate to someone else. But won't that lead to compassion fatigue? Well, to understand this seeming paradox, a great place to start is with arguably the world's foremost expert on compassion, the 14th Dalai Lama. And he said, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. And it turns out there's plenty of evidence that he's right. Compassionate people have reduced physiological responses to stress, they have less stress hormones released in the body, they have improved immune function, more relaxed cardiovascular systems, and more feelings of human bonding. In fact, recent evidence has emerged that being compassionate also stimulates our dopamine reward system. So now back to compassion fatigue. Well, compassion itself does not fatigue us. It begins with, but does not end with, empathy. And from initial feelings of empathy, I believe there are 2 possible subsequent pathways: compassion or empathic distress. So moving a step beyond and perhaps above empathy is compassion. It is other-centered and constituted by positive emotions, caregiving, affection, and kind action. On the other hand, empathy can turn into empathic distress if we over-identify with the other person's suffering and don't convert it to compassion. So, we need to tune into our empathy to learn from it and then dial it down in favour of compassion. As a Canadian veterinary surgeon, Tricia Dowling, put it in a paper discussing these issues, compassion goes beyond feeling with the other to feeling for the other. The person who is suffering can then resonate with our positive feelings towards them. And just one more thing. When you're next struggling with life, as we all do from time to time, you can also reach out to others for support. Allow them to be compassionate to you. In this way, you'll also be doing them a kindness. All right, so let's go to our Q&A, and here are those promised generous people. And as always, I'm very impatient almost, I think, to hear what you took from the podcast and what observations and questions you might have. We might start with, we might play a dangerous game here, and we'll start with Chris.
Hopefully not too dangerous.
Yeah.
One of the parts that I found particularly resonant was the, that notion of starting from empathy. And let's preface thinking about it from the lens of somebody who has a team that I work with. And often, people from the team will surface issues that I'm meant to deal with. And some of those can be, even emotionally challenging for them, or causing some sort of a friction point of which I am brought in to solve. And often that starts with that, that empathetic response. And I find that the subsequent result, kind of like whether that turns into what was the term, the empathetic distress versus staying out of that, really comes down to 2 things. A, can I solve the problem for them?
Yes.
You know what I mean? Because that way that alleviates that for them, and it keeps it at another level. And speaking from my own perspective, when I can't solve that, then it becomes a challenge to keep that level of detach.
Yeah.
The other part is maybe I, or what we are doing as a company, is the source of the distress, which means there is no necessarily solution that's going to pull them up. So
Okay.
addiction continues, which can be, maybe that doesn't necessarily cause me some empathetic distress, or maybe it does because I'm not able to write the circle around for myself. I'm not able to get them necessarily aligned back, to kind of come out of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I should have been taking notes though, Chris, because and you'll have to help me to not miss the components of that. But let's start with you said if you can solve the problem for them, then you don't fall into empathic distress. I think that's right, was it?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Well,
let's
together to solve it. Yeah.
yeah. So let's just deal with that first. The first thing is that the empathic distress is got to do with our resonance with their emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so obviously, if you solve the problem, their emotions come down, and they're happy, and now you might be resonating with their positive emotions, thus no distress.
Right.
Okay, so that's kind of an easy one, and actually, it may or may not involve compassion, right? Knowing you, it probably does involve compassion, but so that's not testing you really.
Right. It's not.
Yeah. So then you had the second part, which is where, for whatever reason, you can't solve the problem, or at least not immediately, and so on. And then they stay upset. Is that right?
Hmm.
And can you just tell me why then you can't maintain compassion?
There's a few different circumstances, but I think the idea is that maybe it is just that their emotions haven't sort of cycled back, or they're still in their own level of distress, that it's really hard for me to kind of stay detached.
Okay. All right.
You know what I mean? In a way that it doesn't.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, so let's compare this to what can happen very frequently in therapeutic process. So someone comes in, they're discussing something. It might be that someone has an incurable disease, someone they love, for example, or there's some circumstance in their life that can't be changed, that is unpleasant, and obviously, I would want to have empathy for the person, but if they're in deep distress, me empathising too much is not only not going to be very good for me, it's not going to be very good for them.
Right.
Right. So you have to kind of keep checking in with yourself and to say, what's the wise thing to do here? What's going to be the most help? Right. And when we notice we're getting upset, it's a bit like in mindfulness practices. If you notice you're trying to focus on the breathing, for example, or some other object of attention, and then you notice you're off, thinking, or you're up, you got strong emotion or something. At that moment, your mindfulness is back because you realise you've been distracted.
Right.
So exactly the same. You're talking to people, and then you suddenly realise, oh, I'm upset here, and my role is to actually maintain some distance. And I have talked. I've got a model that I often discuss with managers, and I call it the empathy continuum. And it's this idea of when in what circumstances should I be dialing down my empathy, right? And there's a number of circumstances. I won't go into all those details, but so just as in meditation, it's not a once only thing. It's a constant practice of realizing I'm falling into a state that's not good for me or for them.
Right.
right? The other thing about compassion is it's not always just sort of, all lovely and cuddly and that sort of stuff. Sometimes, you would know, I think all of you would know as parents that sometimes to be compassionate with our children, we have to do things they don't like because it's best for them. And that's frequently the case for managers.
Yeah.
But I think the other little piece here is, and this is the same in the therapeutic situation, is it's not necessarily your job to fix up the feelings of your staff members. Now, of course, if people are upset, we always do our best to help calm them down. But they have some weight to carry in that relationship as well. Now, the final thing, I think I am remembering all the components. I knew. See, I was right to be afraid. I think the final part was, what if the company itself has caused the problem? Is that right?
Yeah. Like the policy that we've set in as madness in my house all of a sudden. The
that's fine.
we've set is the, maybe the source of their distress.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you think about that one, so now you are a representative of the entity that's causing them suffering. Is that right? Yeah. So now you're going to be feeling guilt. Is that right? Or some sort of related emotion. Am I on the money here, or?
Yeah, or just like recognizing that, like, there might be I can recognize how they're upset and they're concerned, but I also understand why the outcome isn't what they want it to be, and there's just it seems like there's two objects that are incapable of reconciling.
Yeah. Now, where I'm unclear here is whether the negative emotions you're feeling is empathic distress or a more complex set of emotions around, guilt might be too strong a word, but, a sense of responsibility for some of this, but also a sense of responsibility that I should always be able to make everyone happy. And
I think
you can't.
Comes from the lack of harmony. The outcome that there's no outcome that will create harmony between those two entities.
Yes. Well, again, I think this is a question of, thinking back like your kids again. You're not always going to create harmony, but that doesn't mean you're not being compassionate. Right. And people have to adjust to reality. That's my definition of mental health, really, that is a good adjustment to reality. And if there are things in place in an organisation that people don't like, they've got to come to their own terms with it, right? Because they're adults and they can make their own decisions and so on, right? Now, if the organisation is doing something that you feel is wrong, then you've got to put your shoulder to the wheel and see if you can exert your influence. Right. But
that's rarely the issue. It's rarely a situation where I think that the organization is wrong. It's more just recognizing that there is just that inherent friction that's never going to resolve necessarily.
Yes, and learning to be a little bit okay with that. Learning to be able to sit with someone else's, unhappiness. It's a bit like, sometimes in life this happens where, for whatever reason, people don't like us. And, you might be reasonably clear in your mind that their feelings are unwarranted. Let's say that's the case. But still stings. We're kind of hardwired to want people to sort of like us. So then it's a kind of self-management process. And, in a latter podcast in this series, we'll talk about self-compassion. So I think this is where, when we get to that I think it's in podcast 3 and 4, we might come back to this issue, if you remember, and we'll talk about then the role of self-compassion. Phew, I think we've navigated that. I think there was 3 questions there, actually. But, it's wonderful. Fantastic. Colleen or Terry, what are your thoughts?
Well, I thought what was really interesting when you said that compassion is human nature, or I guess being
Yes.
as much as being self-involved, or
Yes.
I think that it's something similar to some of your other podcasts that are really important. I think this is a really important one because, it's as you've discussed, being a pessimist versus an optimist and introvert to extrovert. I think that empathy seems to be a big issue now, or lack of empathy.
Yes.
With
oh gosh, there's some really big questions in there. But the first part, I think it is wired in. We're kind of contradictory creatures because we've also got the self-interest wired in, right? And very often the Darwinian take on human nature is misunderstood as, we talk about survival of the fittest and, self-interest. But evolutionary psychology really looks at, for example, a thing called reciprocal altruism. And this is, as much as defining of us as is self-interest, right? And obviously, we're such a social species. We cooperate to such an extraordinary level. You'd want to have some mechanisms that motivate that. And so we get such joy from being altruistic, and it's unalloyed joy. It seems to be a very pure kind. The Buddhists talk about empathetic joy, and it's a real thing. And I think often we feel that out of, when we act compassionately towards other people. I mean, that notion is a broader one, empathetic joy. It's just simply taking great pleasure from someone else's pleasure, right? But, you don't have to go very far to see that, do you? I mean, if you have a friend who's just smiling, their face is going to break, their smile is so big, we start to feel good. But the latter part of your thing, Colin, was very interesting. You said something about, I think, am I right? Something about this great need for empathy at present. Is that what you said? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's missing in a lot of. It should be something that is recognized, maybe not taught. It should come naturally, but it should be recognized.
Yes. You don't realize you don't realize it, I don't think, but you've just walked into quite a controversy in psychology, and that is, is empathy an unalloyed good? Is it always good? And it's obviously, in this podcast, we talked about how you can have empathic distress, but the dark side of empathy is antipathy.
Yeah.
And if you think about the polarization of our current times, people inside the polarized groups have very, very high empathy for each other and great antipathy for those in other coalitions or in other parties or in other, right? And
it can become overwhelming.
Yeah. And see, empathy is actually designed, again, basically for kin and for those who are kin-like. For small numbers of people who look like us, who think like us, i.e. the people in my village. So racism, for example, is always a failure of empathy, but you can kind of predict it given the original purpose for empathy, right? Where does compassion fit into this? I think it's the solution. to the limits of empathy, right? When we take a compassionate stance, we might be able to then have a more positive empathy for our enemies or people we disagree with. And I think compassion allows us to think our way out of the constraints of empathy with my in-group. And it allows us to let in. So compassion is much more, in my view, is much more, is wiser, and it's in some ways more intellectual, because it's driven by a desire to help the other and to do the wise thing, the thing that will actually help, right? And that's not very often what empathy can be about. So there's a wonderful book by an American psychologist called Paul Bloom, and the book is called Against Empathy. All right, and he's a very balanced person. He knows that there's great importance to empathy, in particular what we might call cognitive empathy, as distinct from affective empathy. So they sort of break it into two aspects. Generally, when we think about empathy, we're thinking about our emotional resonance or affective empathy. But cognitive empathy is like, can I put myself in their shoes? Now, it's that latter one that I think we need more of, that can then move into compassion. Right. So again, a long answer, but because I think our common sense can lead us astray here, that we always think I need more empathy, and yes and no is the answer. So I hope I haven't muddied the waters too much for you, Colleen. Oh, I can't hear you.
Having grown up in Canada and spent half of my life now in America, it's one of the things that I find differentiates.
Mm.
And it's just it's something that was a big part of my upbringing that is missing here. Maybe that's terrible.
Yeah,
to say, but
well, as
really
as a generalization, I think that
yes.
That's probably right. And so this shows again, in a sense that it shows us that we have influence.
Exactly.
That we can cultivate healthy kinds of empathy that can then allow us to be compassionate, right?
And it's easy to do. It should be easy to do.
Yeah, there's so many things in being human that should be easy, but like telling the truth always,
We all do that, don't we?
Yeah, kind of. Terry, what's going on in that cranium of yours?
Well, there's one thing that made me laugh. The rewards for being nice was very general Freudian, which I thought was, it kind of made me think of all of Freud's earlier, experiments. But the thing that really, that I spent a lot of time thinking about was this: when you over-identify with someone's empathy and trying to get out of that to create that distance so you can have compassion in a real honest way. The other person doesn't want you to do that. They want you to keep going down that rabbit hole, feeling all their pain and all of their issues. And I find sometimes if I don't go all the way down, I can't help pull them up. And if I disconnect, I'm viewed as being a bit cold.
Correct.
And this is in personal life, and sometimes it can be in business life, when you have a large team and you have HR issues, and sometimes people can't understand why you think a certain way, and sometimes why you, after a little while, you don't care about what they think about what you think. Right? And I can say that as like a CEO, because you can just get Velcro down in all that stuff and progress nowhere.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, a couple of really good stepping off points here, I think. In a different context, in teaching people, counseling and coaching skills, I often talk about what I call the optimal therapeutic distance, right? And so and it's a moving thing. There are times when one needs to move in close so the person feels our empathy, right? And then we need to find what's the optimal amount of empathy. And this is, I guess, would be opposed to views of, human interaction generally, but say counselling, coaching, that I call kind of hand-holding approaches. And they're very, very high empathy, high empathy, high empathy, high empathy, high empathy. And what happens there is the person just gets mired in the problem, right? And because now we're in absolute 100% agreement about how terrible it is and how terrible other people have treated you and how shocking it is, and maybe I'm crying now as well, and it's a catastrophe.
I think the issue is I don't cry, and that's where the catastrophe
comes. Yeah, but then as you say,
I empathize, but
yeah,
I'm not as emotional as them. I don't want to go down.
No,
right into that mud because I don't want to get stuck in it.
Now, I think I've got a kind of solution for this, Terry, and it relates to compassion. I'll tell you a story. Obviously we're just, we're sort of coming out of the pandemic, in many ways. But for that 2 years, my professional life was converted to what we're doing now. And so a big part of the experience of video conferencing, 5 days a week in the working hours, when I'm coaching people or counselling people, whatever, is because of the nature of the medium, I'm seeing my face a lot while I'm interacting with people, which of course you never do in Zoom I hide self view because I find it a bit distracting. But one thing I noticed, when dealing with people who are very upset, they might be crying, or they're very, very, if I can put it, I hope this doesn't sound too harsh, they're very enamored of their problem, very attached to it, Anyway, but I've noticed, and I'm quite pleased about this, I've got to say, I've noticed that most of the time, even when they're in the depths of things, my face looks pretty happy. It doesn't look detached. It doesn't look non-connected. It kind of looks kindly.
So can I do that when I'm not on Zoom and still not be viewed as being not empathetic?
Yeah.
Enough?
Yeah, that's what it... But, I mean, I just...
having the worst day of your life, they're telling your problem, you're like...
No. What was nice about this unexpected feedback, for me, was that I wasn't trying to do it. I didn't even realise. Right? If you'd asked me, I would have said, "Oh no, I'm being empathetic," but I kind of saw, no, actually being compassionate, and they are quite different things. And a way of thinking about it. So. And I am certain that the people on the other end don't perceive me as being cold and distant or non-engaged.
I also think you have a warm and fuzzy voice, and that helps a lot.
Well, perhaps. But it's not just that, Terry. It's the whole enchilada. But, that's a really... It's a complex question. But, if you watch... people who are genuinely compassionate, working with people who are suffering, I think you'll see this. Yeah. And there's a kind of happiness, there's a kind of affection and a kind of kindliness rather than, I'm in the trenches with you. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, of course, I don't think you can just start there. I think there has to be, in that therapeutic distance thing, there has to be some showing of, authentic empathy. If someone tells you something terrible and you don't say something like, "Oh, that's shocking, that must be so hard," I think you're going to lose them. But then it's the shift to what I call a possibility space.
Yeah.
And that's what compassion's about. It's actually trying to help people. You know, once we've really empathized and understood their situation. Does that help, Terry?
Yeah. I don't think it solves the whole issue, but that's perfectly fine.
No, well, it can't solve the whole issue because it's really, really hard to do and get it right and get that distance right.
That optimal distance is definitely fluid.
Yeah, and you have to pay attention.
And obviously the more that you do it, and you've done it thousands of times, it becomes natural.
And I still make mistakes.
I only hope that I get to the natural part. I'm fine with the mistakes because I know I'm going to make them. So.
And it's like anything else. Again, we talked about mindfulness earlier. Mindfulness is about realizing when you're not paying attention. And this is exactly the same. If you're not picking up what's going on over there, then you're in your own head somewhere.
Yep.
And you redirect attention, and that usually then creates that sort of connection with people again. Yeah, but they're just as sensitive to compassionate connection as they are to empathic connection. And it's the latter that, generally speaking, moves them along. Yeah. Fantastic, guys. That was I really enjoyed that. And we'll be catching up again soon for part 2, because, here we've spoken about why is it important. And the next part's going to be, well, how do we build compassion? All right, and I look forward to that. See you guys.